Hello, and welcome back to the Machine Commons podcast. Today, with the third episode, we're looking at the future of work. We've spent a lot of time talking about the connection of artificial intelligence use cases with vision, about how a global collective powered by Steve's consultancy expertise will help us deliver incredible use cases and incredible capability to businesses almost irrespective of their vertical. There are so many different types of functions that artificial intelligence can serve in the organization and workplace, in research organizations, in manufacturing, in business intelligence analytics. And we talk a lot about artificial intelligence and what it can do, but perhaps we thought we should spend a little bit of time talking about the implications on people. After all, so much of business is human centric, and human resource has always been the most valuable asset until today, perhaps. So, Steve, how about you kick us off? Have you got any thoughts here?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, lots of thoughts, as always. I'll try to get some of them over today. So, I think the sort of the change of how people work has allowed it to become a lot more acceptable for people to be working at home, and that has changed and increased the reliance on digital technology. You've also got what I would like to term sort of the digital workforce. So the rise of technology through things like robotic process automation, taking on the roles and the functions of a lot of the traditional sort of office-based tasks that people did, whether that's invoice processing, whether it's automating a particular project task that people do on a regular basis. Lots of investment has gone on. You've seen lots of hype in the market around RPA and even low-code, no-code platforms and so on, and how they can automate what people do. And a certain amount of progress has been achieved through that, along with the longer-term sort of digital transformation agendas that organisations have had that have evolved how we use technology for operating businesses and how they work. I think the interesting thing is sort of having done those initial steps, what's next? How's AI layering on top of that really transform how organizations operate?
So let's just contextualize this within digital transformation, because I think that's a great place to start. Something where everyone will be able to relate to digital transformation of some kind. So with Web 2.0, with including computation more and more in general, with increased software applications, versus now the introduction of a form of intelligence, a form of cognition, a form of thinking. It's not just about the organization of information anymore. It's not about the gathering of that information. It's actually about the interpretation of that information. And I think there's a lot of nervous people out there. I mean, it's funny. I was watching quite an old-fashioned show, which was sort of back to the 1800s, and this conversation was around in the 1800s, or when the first printing press was introduced. People were worried about machines and machines replacing human beings. Just where are we compared to that sort of transition? Is this transition different? What is it that makes AI and the introduction of thinking software maybe a little bit different?
Whether it's the printing press, whether it's AI-enabled chatbots nowadays, for example, it always is a concern. But quite often we will go through that, we'll get over that, and actually it becomes mainstream. The whole world of AI, there's a lot of positivity in terms of what it can achieve, and a lot of people are doing good things with it. Equally, there's a lot of concern around, well, actually, what's it going to mean for people in terms of the human workforce? Is it going to start taking control of what we do? Ultimately, it's up to us on what we choose to apply AI and where we choose to apply it for the good of us as sort of citizens of the world, but equally in terms of the business context and how we actually apply it for benefit to our customers, but also evolve what our employees are doing and how do they contribute more, and being able to do that by allowing technology to do some of the more mundane things behind it. AI can process data very well, and it can understand it and it can interpret it based on what's gone before, perhaps, or to detect anomalies and do different things based on that. But we still will want to rely on human beings to innovate, to come up with new ideas, to communicate with other people. And although we can do that with technology to some extent, if we want to come up with some original thought, we want to come up with a way of persuading and encouraging our contacts, for example, our customers to do more business with us, then we will still benefit more from people being involved in that loop than technology. Technology is not really there yet to do that sort of thing.
And I think we're talking about the improved efficiency with which we convert resources into productivity, right? And so, speaking widely, these sorts of improvements are a GDP enhancer. And if anything, our economies and the way that the Western world seems to be geared, the way that capitalism seems to be geared, is that it's kind of grow or die. Only really two states of the universe, even. It's either something is growing or something is dying. And so I see that very much as a consolation. This technology, when introduced successfully, is going to help people achieve more. That's ultimately what it is. It's not beyond paying the electricity bill and paying the software engineers to install it. There's nothing that we're actually, there's no real cost really. There's not much of a variable cost to having this stuff in action, unlike a human being who's still being paid. Ultimately, the way that I see this is that it's the human beings that are benefiting. Yes, at an economic level, at a GDP level, at a productivity level, but also in terms of just the quality of work. I see the types of tasks that human beings will be allocated to be completely different. I'm curious, Steve, have you already worked in some way to either augment or replace otherwise human functions?
Yeah, there are a host of examples, I think, around how process automation technologies have been used. Typically, we're talking about data that resides within multiple systems or comes from multiple different locations. Traditionally, we've had people bringing that data together to support whether it's an overall order to cash process, so the full life cycle of the client ordering something and it getting delivered and paid for. But every element of that, if you look at it, there are stages within it where you're thinking, well, all I've got is I've got a human being who's taken data from one system, perhaps applying a little bit of thought on what they need to do and then applying it into another system. And that's traditionally what a lot of back office functions have done within businesses. It's moved data around and makes the decisions around it. If you think about what they're actually doing, and you think about from a finance perspective, for example, a lot of what you want those people to do is to follow a series of rules. So we're not even really necessarily talking that advanced when it comes to sort of AI. We can, for 90% of what perhaps those decisions that are being made, they're based on some rules. Where we can then go a bit further is to say, well, actually, we've got some edge cases now. We've got a set of data that might conflict. It might be that we're borderline or we're a little concerned here. How do we encapsulate that concern about a supplier, for example, or whether a customer's going to pay us or whatever? And how do we use that for our benefit? How can we then say, well, actually, I now want to focus an individual on this particular case because we believe it's outside the scope of what we've managed to achieve through standard automation or through AI being there to enable and detect those anomalies and then raise it to someone perhaps to do it. So we don't have to go that full piece and say, well, actually, I want to automate everything that the business does and I want to add AI into that and do all things. Well, actually, let's do it incrementally. Let's do the mundane. And I think a lot of organizations have done a good chunk of the mundane, but they tended to do that through automating what I would say is as is. So they take a process that's run by a team and they automate what the people used to do, but it's not really transformative. It's not really looking at, and I think this is the topic of our whole conversation here, really. It's not really looking at the organisation as a whole and saying, well, actually, how do I want to change that? How in 10 years' time or 5 years' time will my digitally enabled organisation want to operate? Does it still want those different siloed teams, for example, that we've traditionally had and different functions that are based around humans and how people work? Or are we actually going to transform that and use some of these technologies to do the things that perhaps people used to do? But I think, as you were highlighting, Alex, to use the people to add more value and actually to do things that they're more interested in doing, to make a difference, to build greater value and not spend their time just sat in front of computers and typing information. And I think that sort of evolution and that combination of the process automation technologies, the AI layer on top, and then the human layer on top of that is really how organizations can get real benefit out of the technology evolution. But they need to plan for that future and not just sort of incrementally just try and, well, I'll automate this thing today and I'll go to this thing, because in the end you'll end up with and I've seen this in organizations where you've now got a team of digital bots doing processes that people used to do, but we're now having to handhold and maintain those as well. And it sort of comes counterintuitive to really what we want to try and achieve out of all of this. But the potential is there. It's really about the right approach.
So does this sort of ladder back to last week's conversation, or perhaps the week before, and just having a data-centric mission, a kind of overarching strategy that links all of this sort of stuff together? Is that kind of where you're getting at here?
I think it's getting that mentality in place is where you can start to appreciate where, AI comes into the mix and helps achieve that goal. The risk is you do the traditional technology project thing where you go, oh, AI is really exciting, I want to use it. Oh, I'll stick it over there in that particular team or in that particular plant because I think they've got a bunch of data, which is it's viable, and you'll achieve something, perhaps, hopefully there. That might be a route to a bigger picture thing. But actually, this technology is coming. Every organisation needs to adopt it, irrespective of size. How do you have that strategy that brings the whole organisation onto that plan to actually achieve the benefit and the growth and the whole 5-year strategy for the business?
I think it would be valuable for us to perhaps run through a few examples, because it's not just automation that we're talking about here. Because I'm working on a really interesting case at the moment, which is to keep a camera to keep an eye on drivers on long haul logistic transport, and the system is intended to monitor driver drowsiness. It can measure how long, how many blinks are happening, how long those blinks are. It can estimate gaze and if a driver's distracted too often. I've learned about something terrifying, which is called microsleeping. I've never even heard the term before working this brief. Apparently, when you're tired, your brainwaves go into actual sleep territory for sort of seconds at a time. And when you're traveling at 100 kilometers an hour, 2 seconds is a much longer distance than you'd kind of want to be asleep at the wheel for. Anyway, so the point being that it's not just about automating current existing workflows and current menial tasks, but this example is in safety. And it's something which it's not necessarily doing anything more or making the human being more productive, but it might reduce your insurance cost. It might increase your safety. It might reduce the number of accidents or road incidents that you have as a company, which are all only good things. And this is just one example. So, but perhaps we can contextualize this with other non-automation examples. How exactly do we see the future of work unfolding?
If you take I'll try and sort of do this in a more generic sense rather than just focus on a particular sector. One of the things that a number of organisations have are networks, for example, whether that's a telecoms network, whether that's a environmental control network, whether that's a utilities company with a water sensor network. That set of different devices is gathering a whole lot of data, a lot of information about what's going on, how well are things happening. If you're in the cybersecurity world, for example, it would be gathering data about what's going on, what's happening. And in a lot of cases, what you're trying to do in there is actually detect anomalies. So in your case, someone falling asleep would be an anomaly in that sense, even if it's for a micro sleep. So that ability to be able to monitor what's going on, and that might be that technology can now do and detect when something's going wrong, when something's an exception to what would be standard. That ability to process high volumes of data, to be able to filter out events, for example, that actually aren't that important. I know one of the problems within utilities industry is when something goes wrong, you can have thousands of different devices telling you something's gone wrong, but actually, which one of those things is the real fault and the real problem and the thing that needs to be escalated to get resolved? And that's where you want the intelligence built in to start filtering out all that rubbish, rather than having what would have been traditionally teams of people monitoring these things and trying to decipher what's going on. Actually, we can now use AI and technology to actually decipher that and interpret and understand, and then make a recommendation. We don't have, and again, this is just to sort of offset some of the fear aspects of this. What we can do with AI is recommend, and we can give evidence, and we can provide information to people to make a final decision. We don't have to automatically send people out and diagnose something or make a decision if we don't want to. The choice is ours on where we go with it. But I think the ability to add an intelligent layer on top of what we've traditionally done and focusing it away around we can make it work for our business and add real value without introducing any risks about what we're doing and things like that is certainly a great benefit to us.
No, that's a great point. And I think where some people get a little bit tripped up when I talk to them about trying to quote unquote inject artificial intelligence into their workflows, the kind of instinctive and possibly defensive reaction is, well, it can't do what a human can do. But I think you said injecting a layer of intelligence or just having like a filter of intelligence is so useful. It doesn't need to be a genius to help. You know what I mean? The computer system, the machine learning system doesn't need to be self-aware to be able to add value to the organization or to the workflow. These things can be a little bit dumb and still be very helpful. And I think when you start to think of intelligence less like a human or a non-human thing, like this binary classification, but you begin to see intelligence as this continuum, and you can add some really smart things powered by deep learning. You can have self-driving cars and chess tournament winning computational algorithms, but you can also just have robotic process automation, or you can have image classification where you're monitoring the safety of a situation, or sensor analytics, like you say. There's this huge continuum of the ways that artificial intelligence can be applied. No matter what business you're in, there's probably something that can be injected into your system. What's the way that managers should be thinking about this? What are the questions, Steve, that people should be asking themselves to even stimulate that conversation at their company?
It is a tricky one, and it's something that we quite regularly have conversations with our clients around, because what we're there to try and do is bridge that gap between a client who really understands what their business currently does, but perhaps doesn't really understand the potential that technology and AI would give them in their context.
Mm,
Um, and what we try to do is take them through a combination of examples of what people similar to them in their world are doing with these technologies, but also to get them to understand where the future is. And when I mean future, I don't mean like 25 years. I mean in the next few years. What are we going to start to see in the industry that will really impact them if they're not on board with these evolutions and these
mm,
changes, and how they're actually doing things? And that's the risk. We do see very large organisations who are investing an awful lot of money in these technologies, and making great advances in certain areas. But that doesn't mean it's not practically available to smaller and medium-sized organisations to do elements of what these bigger businesses are doing, and achieve real benefit for them and how they engage their customers and so on through that. But it's I think it's a lot about opening the eyes and understanding where the potential is, and not going directly into a particular niche focus area. So I think if you can set that wider vision of, oh, this is what we could achieve, then we start to have incremental steps to go in there. And that might be a specific project with a particular area, but it's part of a wider strategy. But I think
mm,
it's that bigger picture view of what's possible, without getting carried away into the hype of trying to do something that really isn't going to be achievable for that
mm,
organisation. Where we come from, machine comms perspective, We've got a host of organisations who have specialist capabilities, specialist solutions in particular areas. Partnering with one of those to suddenly bring in this new innovative product capability or new way of doing things that can be built and specialised particularly for that business to add real value to that business. And it's that connectivity, both in terms of vision, but also with people who actually understand and can help realise the outcomes that are needed.
Well, I suppose that's it. The future of AI in the workforce, to have an artificially intelligent colleague might be a refreshing break, and the future is exciting. It means that companies, that individuals will be safer, more efficient, better resourced, perhaps will get the chance to focus on things that they enjoy doing better. The future of AI in the workforce is something to be excited about, but you need to ask that question. It's about thinking, as Steve says, it's about thinking AI first, being curious. Is it possible to inject AI into this workflow to help my human beings do their job better, to help my company output more efficiently? Anyway, thank you so much for joining us for another episode. Slightly longer today, so I hope you've enjoyed that and stayed with us. Any questions, please don't hesitate to get involved, to add that comment. Please share and like this content. You know how much it means to us and will support the channel. Thanks again for your time.
So everybody,
Contact information is on the screen right now. Don't hesitate to get in touch.